Namayan Dotem, Nishna Beganing, Gashing, and Dunji. My name is Danielle Morrison. I'm a lawyer with Cochrane Saxburg, and I'm legal counsel for the family of Christy Zabrowski and William Hudson. We're brought together today under circumstances that have caused great outrage and a continued sense of loss and tragedy as we stand with the family of Eishia Hudson and the response to today's public release of the Independent Investigation Unit's final report. I'm joined by the parents of Eishia, William Hudson, and Christy Zabrowski, along with members of the Indigenous community, dignitaries, and leaders who stand in solidarity and with similar emotions today. Today we will hear from the family, as well as speakers that have been invited to share their message of support and condolence. Christy and William will offer their remarks, followed by Justice Critic Nahani Fontaine, Member of Parliament for Winnipeg Centre Eishia Gazan, Arlen Dumas, Grand Chief Garrison Setti from MKO, and Grand Chief from SEO Jerry Daniels. At this time, I'd like to invite the family of Eishia so they may make their statement.
I'm Eishia's dad. My daughter was a young Indigenous girl who was only 16 years old. You know, she had a great smile. You know, if anybody out there knew who she was, you know, she definitely wanted to light up the room. She wanted to be the loudest one in the room. You know what? She loved sports. I had her in basketball and hockey. She loved both. This is, you know, I've tried to pray and hope for the best, but also prepare myself for the worst. But as a parent, you can never prepare yourself for this. I've tried, and I've tried to walk in here and last night and to be ready for this decision. It's bad to say because I knew what the decision was going to be before hearing the report. With the decision given by the investigation unit, I feel complete anger. I feel the report was unclear and one-sided. I feel frustrated and disappointed with the outcome. The IIU works with the police every day. They can't be trusted to give a fair opinion. The report states that the footage is the most reliable piece of evidence. The statement from the subject officer and his recollection does not add up with the video footage. Look at the statement, watch the video. They do not go together. It's what I did last night. You know, I watched the video over and over. I don't know how many times, and for a parent to watch that video, I know if I'm not sure if you guys have seen the video, but a parent to watch that video over and over to hear those gunshots take your daughter's life, and then trying to put the report together. You know, I find systemic racism is strongly in, I'm not going to say, well, you know what, it's strongly in the police force, and what's going on right now with everything that's going on, with the murders, systemic racism is alive. It's all over, and it's bad that the Winnipeg police are protected for what they do. You know, there's nothing, you know what, independent investigation unit. You know what I say to that? You know what, there's nothing independent about it when you got officers, you know, investigating officers. There's nothing independent about that. And this expert that has his opinion, I find his opinion to be biased, unsatisfying. You know, his opinion as an expert to this report and watching the video going to the report, I don't know. I don't find him to be an expert. That's just how I feel. It is clear that the most important thing to take away from the subject officer statement is that he identified Eishia, my daughter, as an Indigenous person. Who was young. Then he made an assumption that she was dangerous criminal, and that she had a weapon. When I seen the report, the main thing that stood out to me on that part right there was the Indigenous part. So when you would identify my daughter or anybody that's Indigenous, is it your first reaction to pull out a gun? Like, would this have happened, say if the person was white, would that have happened? I highly don't believe that it would have happened. The report shows that the officer was brand new to his job. In the report also says the officer just got his gun handling in 2019 of June. So that makes the officer fairly new to the job. Not even 8 to 10 months around that time. What gives him the right to do what he did when he was the last officer? If you look at the report, I know it's going to be public. If you look at the report, the officer had time. He was the last one on scene, had time to get to his trunk, pull a spike strip, and throw him down on the east yield side of Fermor Lachemodier. And then had time to show, or to take the spike strip away from the road and still run up to my daughter in the vehicle and have his gun drawn and kill my daughter. What does that show for training in a law? We try, and all of our community as Indigenous and other, we try to bring justice and awareness to everything that's going on. But when a young officer that just came on the force could get away with something like this, what does that show for our people? And what does it show for them to show that what they could get away with? I know we're going to fight and continue to fight. I will not stop fighting for my daughter. This fight will go on, and I know the support we have behind us is very wow. You know what? Wow is the word to say. Like, I'm so touched by how many people are supporting the family right now. The leaders, the community. You know what? I want change. You know what? And you know what? I know my daughter was 16 years old, and I want her name to be known out there. And you know what? I want them, when a cop pulls out his gun, think twice to what you're doing. You know what I mean? This has to stop. In Canada, in Manitoba, in law enforcement, in, you know what I mean? Our lives matter as well. All the other officers that were on scene that day, before this officer showed up, none of them had their guns drawn. On the passenger side of the vehicle, there was a cop, I read in the report, had his taser out. I imagine that cop probably had some years on the force. You know what I mean? I imagine that cop has children as well. The officers that came, they didn't respond or resort to deadly force, and yet he was the last officer on the scene, but still did deadly force towards my daughter. You know what? For someone that was last on the scene, yet had the biggest statement in this report. But you know what I think of that? You know what I think of that report? It was whitewashed, very, very racist towards all Indigenous peoples. It's, you know what I mean? It was bullshit. That's what it was. The police officers involved, unlike regular people, can't be interrogated by police in the IIU investigation. Anyone who shoots someone dead is interrogated by police. The police would do anything they could to interrogate a shooter, suspect, and get a confession. This is just one example of the bias in favor of the police authority that we have today. Not only today. I've been going back and looking at murders and everything else throughout this, and it goes on years. It doesn't just go on with what happened to my daughter. Which is why the family and everybody else as leaders and everybody else as supporters, you know, has come out to the couple rows we had. And that shows to me that leaders want change. And you know what? With the people we have in today, I'm sorry, I told myself I wasn't going to get into this part, but the only one that has the power right now to call an inquiry is Pallister. in Manitoba. But do we see Pallister going to call an inquiry on this? I don't. I strongly feel I don't see it, and it shows bad for Indigenous people that cops could get away with this. But I feel I have very strong supports that are going to be and stand with me throughout. We know that charges are not being laid against the officer. We don't know how this officer is being disciplined, or if there's any consequences for the officer who uses excessive force. All of this shows the sad reality of how systemic racism runs strong within our justice system. We know that an inquest will be called. We want more impartial assessment of investigations finding done. We are seeking for a public inquiry into the police-related deaths of Indigenous peoples. I'm going to finish those couple of sentences.
There needs to be comprehensive investigation to what happened with our daughter Eishia and other Indigenous people who have suffered the same ending. Change is needed so this never happens again, because we would never wish this on another family.
Thank you, and that's our speech from the family, or statement from the family. Thank you.
Miigwech, William and Christy, for your strength. Know that we stand here in solidarity with you. You're not alone. I'd like to invite NDP Justice Critic Nahani Fontaine at this time to come and make some remarks.
Good evening, everyone. First and foremost, let me begin by saying the Manitoba NDP stand in solidarity with the family of Eishia Hudson. We are in full support of the calls that the family is issuing today in respect of a public inquiry. I think it's really important for folks to understand the context in which the shooting death of Eishia Hudson occurred. For generations now, there is an onslaught of violence that is perpetrated against the bodies of Indigenous women and girls in Two-Spirited. And often that violence is perpetrated on our bodies with impunity. We have had generations of Indigenous women go missing and murdered with little justice that we've seen from coast to coast to coast. And so you can understand then the frustration of the family and the community, but also Indigenous women who would take this personally when we see the IIU continue what is that colonial process and exercise of excusing violence in all of its forms against Indigenous women, girls, and Two-Spirited. And we see that today in the release of the IIU report that did not recommend any charges against the officers involved. We ought not live in a province whereby the police become the judge, jury, and executioner of Indigenous bodies, and in this case, an Indigenous child. We ought to, as a province, demand more from our policing institutions so that there is recognition of use of force that is executed on the bodies of Indigenous peoples when they come into contact with police. And so we fully support the call for a public inquiry and an inquest. And I just want to quickly, I don't want to take up too much time, but I do want to just break down what are the mechanisms that are currently available to the family in seeking transparency and some semblance of justice in understanding how we are here today. The Chief Medical Examiner can call, under the Manitoba Fatalities Inquiries Act, can call an inquiry, which is an in-house review of the incident, which is mandatory whenever there's a use of force death. Or the Chief Medical Examiner can call an inquest, which is court-based, and that's called when there is a death in custody. And I think that what we'll find is the narrative is going to be that it's a little black and a little gray here. And what I would suggest today, and what I would put on the record today, is that the WPS were in the process of getting Miss Eishia Hudson into their custody when they shot and killed her. And that demands an inquest. It demands that the Chief Medical Examiner call an inquest. What I would also suggest is that it demands that the Chief Medical Examiner calls an inquest expeditiously. We've actually seen in past cases where there's been inquests that have been called, but years later. We know that on the daily, the WPS come into contact with Indigenous peoples thousands of times a day. And we know that at the same time that Eishia Hudson was killed, within the span of a couple of weeks, 2 other Indigenous folks lost their lives at the hands of the Winnipeg Police Service. That requires that an inquest be called expeditiously. The third process that's available that we also support and the family has called on is a public inquiry. And Aisha's father is absolutely right that the Premier of Manitoba can call that, but also I would suggest that the Minister of Justice can right now, today, call a public inquiry into the shooting death of Eishia Hudson. And I would suggest that it is in the best interest of not only the family of Eishia Hudson, but all Manitobans in seeking transparency and justice in the way that our policing institutions operate in this province. So once again, it is our deepest condolences to the family, and we stand absolutely in solidarity, and we say miigwech.
Thank you, Nahani. At this time, I'd like to invite Member of Parliament for Winnipeg Centre, Eishia Gazan.
This is a very good family. They are a very kind family. William, Christy, William's partner, Cheyenne. And as a mother, particularly, life is really valuable. I've had the privilege to get to know the family quite well since the shooting of Eishia Hudson, which happened to be on my birthday, the same time as 3 Indigenous peoples, which included Eishia Hudson, were shot and killed by Winnipeg City Police. We have issues of systemic racism. We have known this since the Aboriginal Justice Inquiry. Eishia, I never had the privilege to know, but I actually am a teacher, and I saw beautiful art that was created by Eishia. She was a talented artist. She was a visionary. She had brilliance that I will never be blessed to know. This is a good family who brought in the world a brilliant spirit. I feel like the system has failed Eishia Hudson. The system continues to fail Indigenous people. They have failed this family. And we need to seriously address this by making necessary changes to the system, which includes reviewing the very close relationship the IIU has with prosecutors and the police. We have known this as an issue for a long, long time. Now, we're aware that there'll be an inquest that will happen. Of course that will happen when you have 3 Indigenous people that are shot and killed within a 10-day period. I support the family's call for an inquiry. Rallies in the summer, thousands and thousands of people from Winnipeg came out supporting justice. We have people marching across the country, calling out targeted racism against BIPOC peoples. Our lives are valuable. And when we're talking about murdered and missing Indigenous women and girls, and then a young woman is shot and killed by the police, that doesn't let me know that we're of value. We owe this to the family. We owe this to families across the country who have lost loved ones at the hands of police. So I stand in solidarity with this family that I care very deeply about, in their kind grace in the face of such adversity. Thank you.
To miigwech, Leah, and miigwech for lending your support to the family for all this time. I know they've been very appreciative. I'd like to invite Grand Chief Assembly of Manitoba Chiefs, Arlen Dumas, to the stand, please.
I want to express my sincere condolences to Eishia Hudson and her family. I want to acknowledge the strength and love that Will and Aisha's mom is showing everybody today, and that Eishia didn't die in vain. It's unfortunate that making erroneous decisions as a child lead to a death sentence in Manitoba. It's truly unfortunate. I support the family as well on their demand, and I insist that there is an inquest. It's truly unfortunate that the report as it is creates no hope. It creates no opportunity to display that despite the difficulties and inconsistencies of people's position, that an entity who's supposed to provide an objective opinion and provide some form of resolution casts more doubt and uncertainty into the mix. I'm very disappointed with the report. From my lay perspective, I see that certain individuals appear to have been guided. A document that should be based on fact and proper information has a lot of gray areas where you can see people are being led to certain directions, where certain aspects of eyewitness accounts are dismissed in favor of arguably people who are at fault. I insist that the Premier demand that there is an inquest, because if this institution cannot actually come up with a report that is actually fact-based and can actually be held up and not be complicated with technicality and procedural excuses, then it does a disservice not only to Eishia, but also to all those police officers who were there, who, regardless of what they did or how they did their duties, are now suspect. And I encourage the Premier to insist that there is an inquest. It's very troubling, and we stand with the family. We will continue to advocate and support them, and we insist that there is an inquiry, and that it must end. It must end, and that it's unfortunate. I remember reading in the news on how the Winnipeg Police Services was celebrating that they have 2 helicopters. Why wasn't that used instead of using lethal force, instead of killing someone? Why weren't any other means put forward? I encourage everybody to watch the video and read the report, and you will see the contradictory statements. You will see why everyone is so concerned and upset, and that something must be done in order to rectify the situation. But those are my comments. We stand by the family. We demand that there is an inquest, and we will continue to stand with in honor of Eishia Hudson's life. Thank you.
Miigwech, Arlen, and my great thanks to the First Nations leadership for coming together and supporting the family at this time. I'd now like to invite Ogima Makwa, Grand Chief Jerry Daniels of Southern Chiefs Organization.
Bonjour. I thank our Creator for another beautiful day. I'm here representing the 34 First Nations in Southern Manitoba in support of the family, and absolutely standing with the call for further examination of the process, and also an examination of the reports that do come to life. Many who have paid attention to what happens with First Nations in the justice system are quite aware of the number of stats that tell a very clear picture about how First Nations people are being treated. Only 11 hours after Eishia's killing, the police shot and killed Jason Collins, a loving father of 3 in Winnipeg. 10 days later, Stuart Andrews, a 22-year-old father, was shot by police on April 18th, also in Winnipeg. All 3 victims were First Nation. In June, in New Brunswick, the RCMP shot and killed Chantal Moore and Rodney Levy, both First Nations people. The video of the beating of Chief Alan Adam by RCMP in Alberta came out in June of 2020. This past Tuesday, the RCMP announced there's no criminal charges that would be laid in the June shooting of Rodney Levy in New Brunswick. Since 2017, Indigenous people have been more than 10 times likely than a white person to have been killed by the police officer in Canada. Indigenous people are also 11 times more likely than non-Indigenous Canadians to be accused of a homicide. Indigenous people, 56%, are more likely to be victimized by crime. Indigenous men account for 25% of the male prison population, 35% of the female prison population in Canada, compared to the 4.9% of the general population that we represent. Canadians need to understand how important those numbers are and the true and real reality of the lives that Indigenous people are facing in Canada. These systemic barriers are real, and you cannot wash that away with an IIU inquiry or report. The foundations of the justice system in this country have values that are not reflective of what justice really means. And I hope that everyone can stand with the family right across the country in calling for a further analysis of what has taken place here, and also changes to the justice system. And the IIU's independence may require further independence. And I think that First Nations leadership should be a part of that, and perhaps international observation over what's happening in this country. Those are some of the solutions, I think, that need to be put in place. This is a long time challenge, what we see happening. When we're talking about a sister, a daughter, and people have to come to terms with the fact that this is lived experience that's happening every single day in this country. And it's quite unfortunate that the stories aren't creating the change that needs to happen. And perhaps we have to have less officers and more people who can understand the reality of Indigenous people when facing these sorts of incidents. Because if you come after an incident like what had happened here, with the intent of facing it with violence, in this case Eishia Hudson, then that is the outcome. But if you approach the situation from a place of love and caring, you're not going to be shooting somebody. And that's the change that needs to happen in the psyche of all our police officers. I know it is a difficult job, but we need to continue to make progress in changing the system that isn't working for Indigenous people. With that, thank you to everyone who continues to fight to create the change that is necessary for all of us. Miigwech.
Miigwech, Jerry. We have one more invited guest that will be joining us over live stream, Grand Chief Garrison Settee of MKO. So we're going to go over to him now.
I apologize for not being there in person, but I assure you that MKO stand in solidarity with the family of Eishia Hudson as they continue to mourn and grieve over their daughter. You can be assured that we'll stand with you as you call for a public inquiry and an inquest into the death of a precious young Indigenous woman. Nothing we can do will ever bring back the life of Eishia. But collectively, we can stand together and say that the shooting of a young Indigenous woman, unarmed, in my view, is a travesty. I do believe that things could be handled very differently. And the IIU report under the use of force section is merely an opinion and does not constitute as the truth. I don't think she had to die. She did not have to be shot. Now we're left with a grieving family, with a sense of helplessness. But we will stand with them, so they will not feel helpless. They will not be alone in their fight and their quest for justice for Eishia. Our Native Americans have a saying, it's a good day to be Indigenous. But for that day, and in that week, 3 Indigenous people were shot by police. It was not a good day to be Indigenous. I hope we learn from this. The police, law enforcement should work with us how we can move forward and correct the injustice of the shootings of Indigenous people by police services. And with that, thank you. Remain strong. Remain committed to helping and standing with the family of Eishia. Thank you.
Miigwech Garrison. That concludes our statements from all of our invited guests. At this time, I'd like to indicate that the family will not be taking any questions from media. Their statement is as it stands, and that is to ensure that nothing will be used later on in any processes going forward. We do have a few questions that are coming in from the media. One is for AMC Grand Chief Arlen Dumas, so I'm going to put that question to him and give him an opportunity. Just by way of process, there have been media requests coming in for interviews one-on-one. Those can be arranged through AMC's communications page or through Cochrane-Saxburg by contacting myself. Those will occur within our office on a one-on-one basis over the telephone or over video. We'll answer as many questions as we can live, but please be patient with us as we're dealing with COVID circumstances and trying to maintain social distancing within our office. So I'd like to ask this question of Grand Chief Arlen Dumas. Does he find parts of the report problematic? And if so, which ones?
Good question, whoever asked that. Yes, I do actually find various aspects of the report problematic. I feel that the report should be objective and be facts-based. But from my interpretation, I see how certain people being interviewed were being, I'd say, guided, and in order to move to a conclusion. I also feel that there's inconsistencies with what was being said, and those inconsistencies are not being taken into account, and they're actually being hived off, and other people's statements are being taken as fact when there is actually inconsistencies in all of the statements. So that's why I have a lot of difficulty with this report.
Thank you, Arlen. The next couple of questions were directed at family, but as legal counsel, we've been asked to speak on behalf of the family. The team for legal counsel for William and Christy are myself, Danielle Morrison, Chris Saxburg, who is a partner at the firm, and general counsel is going to be Murray Sinclair, who has just recently joined the firm. We're very lucky to have everyone on board. They offer a plethora of knowledge and wisdom and experience with inquiries and inquests. So the question is, what next steps, if any, is the family planning on taking now that the report has been released? There's 3 main things that we're asking for. First and foremost, we're looking for an independent assessment of these findings. It is very clear that there is an impartial bias by the IIU. We're asking for outside counsel to look at those results and those findings from the report and all the investigation and make a different opinion. We're not asking for the same opinion, we're asking for an impartial investigation. Second to that, of course, an inquest will happen. It is legislated through the Fatal Accidents Act that the chief medical examiner must call an inquest, but we don't want it to end there. This type of inquest needs to be comprehensive. The last inquest that was, to a certain extent, as comprehensive as it could be was the Brian Sinclair inquest, but they were still limited in its scope. They weren't able to look at the racism that was systemically affecting Indigenous people, which is why we're asking for third, a public inquiry. An inquest is limited. A public inquiry is going to address the systemic racism that involves police interactions with Indigenous people. Those were the two questions that we were able to solicit right now. I understand that there's likely questions that are coming in through Facebook Live. We do invite watchers to send your questions to AMC Communications team or to myself. We'll be arranging one-on-one interviews with legal counsel for the family and for all the other speakers who have joined us today. That concludes our media event, and I put it to the public at this point. We're asking you to stand in solidarity with this family. They have been through so much. It took them so much to stand here and make that statement. I can't imagine that the pain will ever go away, but I want them to know that we're here for them. This is just the beginning. We have a lot of work to do. Chimigwech.